Hi, my name's Connor, and in this video I'm going to be talking about how to make your first character in Dungeons & Dragons 3.5. So the reason I'm making this video is because I've taught quite a lot of new players how to play D&D, Dungeons & Dragons, and it's a process that can take quite a long time, especially on your first go-around. And oftentimes when I've done these, I've had basically every player for that game come together. We do one first session, a session 0, to learn how to play. And often this involves making everybody's character, and what could easily be like an hour-long process quickly turns into like 4 or 5 hours. So that's why I'm making this video. I want to give people a quick and concise overview of how to make your first character, and just generally as a good reference that I could send people later on to learn how to play the game. So that's the reason why I'm making this. Now, why am I talking about version 3.5? Well, quite frankly, that's the version that I play. It's the one I'm most familiar with, and I wouldn't be teaching something I didn't know quite well. So that's why I'm doing this. I want to teach people how to play the one that I like the most, I've played the most, and I enjoy, and I think it's a really good version. And that's not to say anything about 5th edition, which is the one people are probably most familiar with because they see it on store shelves, which is much more streamlined and very similar to the one that I prefer to teach people. So with this, I'm going to walk you through how to make your first character, and really it all revolves around this, the D&D 3.5 character sheet. This everything here is going to show you what you need to know about your character, all the numbers and stuff like that. And at first, this piece of paper can be extremely intimidating. There's a lot of things on it that if you're not familiar with the game, or you're not familiar with RPGs in general, you're going to find it very difficult to navigate. But we'll walk through one step at a time. So you're going to need a copy of that, whether it's digital or in paper. You're going to need a pencil, and you're going to need a set of dice. Now, in D&D, there is a whole collection of dice, which I had on hand a second ago, but not anymore. Really, you're going to need 4 6-sided dice, so your classic ones that you're used to playing with other games. And then some more complex ones, like a 20-sided die, a 12-sided die, a 10-sided die, working your way down. So we'll walk through this one step at a time. So we'll start with the most basic part. Top of the sheet, you're going to have some spaces for your character name and your name. You're also going to see some spaces there for like your class and your level. You're going to see some spaces there for your race, your alignment, your deity, size, age, all kinds of other stuff. And when you look at this, there's a few things that I'll go into a bit more depth in future videos. But really, we're going to work through the basics here. So put your character name, your personal name, and put those on the sheet. For the class and the level, we'll get to those a little bit more in a future video. But for now, just put level 1 and leave the class blank. For your race, that's another thing. If you're familiar with any kind of fantasy setting, you can pretty much pick anything that's a classic, like a human, a gnome, a halfling, an orc, an elf, anything like that. And if you're not familiar with that, I just recommend just go watch Lord of the Rings. Simple as that. For your alignment, there's all kinds of stuff here. There's a set of 3x3 where you've got your lawful spectrum and you've got your good and evil spectrum. So you've got lawful and chaotic, good and evil. And you take a combination of lawful through to neutral to chaotic, and then you also take another combination of good, neutral, and evil, and you put them together. So some characters can be lawful good, you can have chaotic evil, neutral evil, and really any combination. So there's 9 possible permutations. You're also going to move on to doing your deity. This thing, it really depends on the campaign setting. You can have really anybody you want. I would just look at the book. Really, a lot of this goes down to just reading the book, but you don't really need to know too much about your deity unless you're a cleric. A lot of it otherwise is pretty straightforward. For your size, most races are going to be medium or small. We'll cover that in the races video. For age, pretty much unimportant from the game. There are some modifiers for being an older character. Gender, pick whatever you want. Height, there's some parameters for your race. For weight, similar for that. Eyes, hair, and skin, pick whatever you want. Now the things that actually are quite important are going to be these 6. Your strength, Dex, Constitution, Intelligence, and Wisdom, and Charisma. So this is where you're going to need your dice. You're going to take 4 dice and you're going to roll them. In most games that you play, you're going to find that you'll roll 4 and take your best 3. So for example, you're going to roll 4 dice and you're going to get 6, 5, 4, 4. You'll take the 6, the 5, and the 4 and keep that, add them together, that's your score. And you'll repeat that process for each one of those stats. So for example, I could roll a 12 on my strength. I then would repeat that 4 dice procedure for Dex. Then I move on to Constitution, Intelligence, Wisdom, and Charisma. Which ones you're actually going to put your scores into really depends on your class. You're going to have basically 6 numbers you're going to roll up from that 4-sided dice procedure. And depending on your class, you're going to then put them in an order that best fits your class's needs. Otherwise, you can also just simply roll them in order, like go through all 6 of those, rolling those dice, and then pick your class based on what scores are best. Either way works. Things I would generally just point out, though, is like rule of thumb, is figure out what your class's best score is, the ones that matter the most. For like a fighter, if you're going to be one that's dealing damage, you're going to prioritize strength. If you're a wizard, you're going to put a lot into intelligence. If you're like a sorcerer, you're going to put stuff into charisma. If you're going to be like a rogue, put lots of stuff into dex. That's just a general rule of thumb. Now, the interesting thing here, actually, is when you're looking at your ability scores, you've got your actual score here in this column, and then you've got your ability modifier. Now, when I reference any form of like your ability score, you're really not going to need to know that number there. Like if you have a 12 in strength, that's not really as important as knowing what the ability modifier is. That's what's going to impact pretty much everything else but your character. How hard they hit, how much damage they can take, how they're good at a particular skill, things like that. So once you have those all filled out, I like to then move on to my hit points. So if you're not familiar with hit points, this is basically how much health you have. That's going to be your HP. So this differs for each class. Some classes are much more tanky than others, meaning that they can take more damage. Others are much more fragile, where they can't take very much damage before they go down. So what you'll do there is you'll take whatever die is required of your class. For example, Barbarian uses a 12-sided die. So you're going to roll a 12-sided die and then add on your Constitution modifier for your health. Every class on their first level, you're going to have the maximum size of your class die, which is your hit die, and you're going to add on your Constitution modifier. So for example, a Barbarian, they can have a maximum of 12 health each level. So you take 12, add on your Constitution modifier. For a Wizard, you can have a maximum of 4 to roll on a dice, and you're going to add on whatever your Constitution is. So say if you have like 16 Constitution as your score, your ability modifier is going to be +3, so you'll add on 3. Moving on, for speed, right over here, that is impacted by what your race is. If you are a human, for example, your speed is 30. Most of the medium-sized races are going to be 30. For smaller-sized characters like a halfling, it's 20 usually. If you are a class that adds speed to that has a speed bonus, you're going to then have a bit of a higher speed. For example, a monk gets fast movement, so they can move a bit faster than their teammates, which helps them get into position a bit better. Next up, we'll talk about some of your AC. This is your armor class. This is essentially saying how hard it is to hit you. So you have your hit points, that's how much damage you can take. Your AC, your armor class, allows you to see if you're even hit in the first place. You might be hit by a weapon, but it's not enough to go through your armor, for example. Your AC is impacted by the actual armor you're wearing. For example, leather armor is not going to provide nearly as much as a set of full plate, like a fully set up knight. Your shield bonus is dependent on if you're carrying a shield or not, and some shields are better than others. For example, like a buckler provides a little bit of protection, whereas a tower shield provides substantially more. Your dex modifier, that's where your ability scores come in. So with hit points, it's your constitution that matters. For your AC, your armor class, it depends on what your dexterity modifier is. Natural armor, for most races, there's no natural armor. This is more of a monster thing. For example, a troll has quite a bit of natural armor. So does an ogre, things like that. Dragons have a lot of natural armor. So they're not wearing actual physical armor, but their body is very resilient to actually taking hits. You'll also have deflection modifier there and miscellaneous modifier you'll see on your armor class. This is not particularly important for a lot of characters, except for, say, monks or spellcasters, where they have spells they can cast like mage armor that give them kind of this invisible force field that allows them to have some form of protection. Next up, we'll move to touch AC, so touch armor class. What this means is that how hard your character is to, say, either hit with a special type of attack. For the most part, you're not going to need to worry too much about your touch AC, but this is attacks that would ignore physical armor that you're wearing or how tough your skin is. So you're going to take what your, that plus 10 there that you'll see on the character sheet. You'll take this plus 10, you'll also take your dex modifier, and you'll take any kind of deflection or miscellaneous that you have, and that will be your touch AC. So for example, say I'm a rogue, I'm wearing leather armor, and I have a plus 4 dex modifier. And what I would do there is I would ignore whatever value the leather armor provides for me, and it would add on the dex. I would keep that. So my touch AC would only be 14, for example, if I had a plus 4 modifier. So it'd be 10 plus that dex modifier to get touch AC. Flat-footed is the complete opposite. So flat-footed is a situation where your character is unaware of an attack that's coming. This could be some kind of surprise attack, or if your character is restrained and can't move. So your dex modifier isn't usable. Instead, you're basically relying on whatever your raw armor is. And I should make a special note about monks here, because they have a special type of armor that is ignored in this case as well, but would be beneficial for touch. So for flat-footed, you're really only dealing with whatever your natural armor is, whatever armor you're wearing, and that will impact what your flat-footed will be. So it'll be 10 plus whatever armor value you have, natural armor, and any kind of deflection or miscellaneous that isn't dependent on movement. So this could be a case where you have a wizard with mage armor, you keep that bonus that mage armor adds because it's like a little invisible force field. Whereas with a monk, you get a special AC bonus that's basically dependent on your character being able to move well. So your dex modifier and things like that are ignored for flat-footed. So knights, any kind of character with a lot of armor, benefits, and generally their flat-footed is very strong. Moving on to initiative. Initiative is basically your character's reaction speed. This is a situation where having a high dex score definitely benefits. And there are also feats like improved initiative that I will touch on later when I talk about feats. And initiative is how quickly you get to get into combat when combat occurs. This is your character's reaction speed, and if you have a higher initiative score, you're generally going to go first in combat more often than others. If you have a low dexterity score, you're probably not going to do as well in this. We'll keep moving on to the next area here. What you're going to see is saving throws. So saving throws are something that are kind of unique to Dungeons & Dragons. There's not really a whole lot of other games that use something like this. So what you have here is you have fortitude, reflex, and will saving throws. These are each based on a different ability score. For example, fortitude is based on constitution, so your constitution modifier makes you more effective at fortitude saves. Your reflex is based on dexterity, so if you have a higher dexterity, you're going to be better at this. And with will, this is your character's wisdom impacts this. It's their ability to resist different kind of mind-affecting enchantments or effects. And what saving throws are is basically if your DM, your dungeon master, or your GM, game master, whatever you might be referring to, these are important for any kind of effect that might be unusual. It's not like an attack. It might be, say, something like a trap or a poison or some kind of enchanting spell or a spell that it's pretty much always described in the special effect that's going on. So your dungeon master will ask, hey, make a fortitude saving throw. And then you'll roll the dice. And then you'll have to take whatever this value is here. And that will impact your roll. So with these saves here, they're basically special effects of things that might impact your character's life, or say it's a poison, or something that will have a special effect to see if you can resist it. And more or less it's a situation of you will have a strong score that allows you to completely ignore the effect or only take half effect. And how it's broken down is that you have your total. This is everything summed up together. You've got your base save, which is dependent entirely on your class. So some classes are going to have a situation where their base save is much higher. It could be, say, a fighter has a high fortitude save. And you take that value there depending on the class. You have your ability modifier. So as I said, like high dex, high con, high wisdom are going to help you here. And then you've got some other effects like a magic modifier or a miscellaneous modifier. These are really dependent on if you have a feat or a spell that's affecting you that improves the score or makes it worse. There's also things like flaws, which are the opposite of feats, but I won't touch on those because those are really a very optional mechanic. But yeah, these values here are if you're affected by something that's out of the ordinary, and the DM will almost always prompt on it. For example, fortitude, if you're getting hit by a poison, you can basically resist it with a saving throw. Same with reflex. If you have a fireball thrown at you, you can roll a reflex save, and you'll take less of an effect if you're successful. Wisdom, or the will saving throw, that's to resist an enchantment or take less of an effect from a spell. So it's very situational, but you should have that completed. Base attack bonus is the next thing when we work our way down. Base attack bonus, this is based purely off of your class. So what this is a bonus you get to actually swinging to hit something, or firing an arrow, for example, to hit something. Classes that are martial, for example, like a fighter or a barbarian, have a much higher score here. They increase by 1 each level. Classes that are more like skills based are going to have kind of mid-range. They'll gain 1 basically 3 times at every 4 levels. And with casters, which are not really meant for combat, they are going to get only every 2nd level. So this is a value that's based entirely on your class. So we'll break that down a little bit further later, but that's what's going to go there. Spell resistance, you'll see, is right next to it. That's much higher level play or special spells that would be impacting you. More often than not, enemies are going to have spell resistance. It's this kind of ability to resist the impact of a spell before it would even do anything. So you fire off a fireball. If they are successful on resisting the spell, they're simply completely unaffected. Grapple. This is going to be your base attack bonus, plus your strength modifier, any kind of size modifier, and then any kind of miscellaneous modifier. This is your ability to grab somebody and basically wrestle with them or restrain them. This is more of like a special maneuver that you can do in combat or out of combat. After this, you're going to see attack. What this means is you've got a couple cells here that are important. You're going to see this first cell here, just below attack, is the name of the item or whatever the attack is. So this will oftentimes be a weapon. It could be a mace, it could be a sword, it could be a bow, it could be a sling, it could really be anything. Sometimes if you're a caster and you often use a particular spell, I fill this out as that spell's effect for whatever is relevant. So you've got your actual attack cell, you've got your attack bonus. The attack bonus is different than base attack bonus. If you are using a melee weapon, so a sword, a mace, or something you physically have to be up in somebody's face with, you're going to take your base attack bonus plus your strength modifier. And then any kind of miscellaneous modifier that comes with that weapon, it's clearly stated. For example, a masterwork weapon is an enhancement you can get for a weapon. It gives you a +1 to attack. So that's a pretty simple calculation of just base attack bonus, strength modifier, whatever else is listed for that particular weapon. For a ranged weapon, this is using your dexterity score instead. You're going to use the base attack bonus plus your dexterity modifier. So, for example, you have a score of 14 for your dexterity, it's going to be +2 is your modifier. And same situation with strength. If you have like 14 strength, it's a +2 modifier. You'll find those modifiers listed in the player's handbook. You'll see next after the attack bonus. So attack bonus is essentially your ability to hit. Damage is the following cell, is if you are successful in hitting an enemy, or maybe even an ally, if it's depending on the situation. This is going to be how much damage you'll actually do when you hit them. This is completely dependent on the weapon. You'll see that some weapons do more damage overall. Oftentimes this is like two-handed weapons do more damage because you need to use both hands, so you can't use a shield instead. For example, a longsword does 1d8 damage, and it only requires one hand, whereas a battle axe, which is a two-handed weapon, does 1d12 damage. And an important thing to note here is that your damage is also dependent on the type of weapon it is. Melee weapons, you always get your strength modifier as extra damage. And if it is a two-handed weapon, or you're holding a one-handed weapon with both hands, you make that modifier 1.5 times its strength modifier. So, for example, if you're using a longsword and you have 14 strength, which is a +2 modifier, you're going to do 1d8 of damage plus your strength modifier of +2. So it's 1d8 +2. That's an 8-sided die, +2 on top. And if you are wielding that weapon with two hands rather than one hand, it's going to be 1d8 plus 2 times 1.5. So it'll be 1d8 plus 3. Another example could be a battle axe, where you're always going to use it with two hands. You can't wield it with just one. You would do a 1d12, and let's say, for example, you have 18 strength. So you'll have +4 as your modifier. So you'll have 1d12 plus 4, and then you'll make sure that 4 is 1.5 times, because it's a two-handed weapon. So it'll be 1d12 plus 6. Critical, what this means is your chance of getting a critical hit. So what this is when you roll a d20, which is the main dice you're going to use for the game, you're seeing if you hit. So each weapon has a different critical chance. For example, a longsword has a critical chance of, if you roll a 19 or a 20 on that 20-sided die, you have a chance to have rolled a critical hit. So you'll then increase the damage overall that you're doing with it by whatever the critical multiplier is. So what you'll see, for example, with a longsword is you've got 19-20. So 19 to 20 is the range that you can get criticals with. And then a 2 times multiplier. So you'll do twice as much damage if you get a critical hit. And something I should note, which I'll cover a bit more in the combat video, is that it'll be just the d20 that you're rolling on to see if you get that critical. And if you do roll a 19 or a 20, for example, with a longsword, you're going to then roll to confirm the critical, which is you basically roll that die again to see if you hit them. And if you do, that means it was a critical hit. So you get usually a special effect and that increased damage. Next up on weapons, you'll find that there is the range cell. Whoops, there we go. Range. This is more important for the like ranged weapons, so like a bow or crossbow, anything like that. Most melee weapons are going to be just right adjacent cells to where your character is, or they're going to be, if you have a weapon that can reach further. Say a long spear, for example, has a range of 10, so you can basically physically hit from further away, but you won't be able to hit adjacent to you. So just keep that in mind. If it's a weapon that doesn't have any range, just put a dash. If it is a weapon that has some range, you put in the value there. A long spear, for example, 10 feet. One thing you should also consider is when you're using a ranged weapon, like a bow or a crossbow, there is what's called range increments, and this is what's really important for them, is that you have a certain range you can fire this weapon before you have any kind of debuff to hit them. Not do damage, hit them. So for example, with a longbow, and I could be wrong with this numbers, it's 100 feet is the range increment. So anywhere within 100 feet, you can hit them without any penalties. For each 100 feet beyond that first 100 feet, though, you have a -2 to hit, but it doesn't impact the damage at all. And I should also note, because I didn't cover it a moment ago, was that damage on ranged weapons is not impacted by your dexterity. It's only melee weapons, because bows, it doesn't matter how far you yank back on it, it's still going to do, it's not going to get any bonus based on your dexterity. You might be able to hit them, but higher dexterity doesn't mean you're really going to hit any better. It's a weird kind of caveat for ranged weapons that I never really agreed with, but whatever. The type, there's 3 different types of damage you can do with melee weapons and ranged weapons, and that is slashing, piercing, and bludgeoning. Some weapons can do both types. For example, a Morningstar does bludgeoning and piercing, whereas a sword only does slashing. There are some types of weapons that can do slashing and piercing because they're meant to also thrust as well, but for D&D's purposes, they pretty much always assume that you're going to then swing with a longsword rather than thrust. Notes is also where you can put anything where, like, it might be enchanted, like a +1 longsword, for example, or it might be a masterwork weapon or any kind of like special details about it. That's what you'd fill into the notes section. One thing I should note about ranged weapons is that, so while you don't get any benefit from having a higher dex score, you can, however, make use of a higher strength score by having a bow that has a stronger pull on it. So you can have a strength modifier that is 0 or higher. You can modify a bow to be stronger for that. So you can basically do extra damage based on how much higher your strength score is, because you can pull it back with a higher draw strength. But that is situational just to the weapon. Now the next part is the one that's really quite challenging. This whole gamut of things here is the skills. It looks really intimidating. It's more of just a little bit tedious to first fill it out, and then once it's filled out, it's your go-to reference for anything more or less out of combat. Each class has their own skills that they are fully capable of, and I'll cover that in another video. But basically each class, some are trained in certain skills and therefore can do them, and they can invest more ranks into them and be better at them than other classes. So you'll find that with D&D, classes really help specialize and flesh out the character, and the race generally gives a bit of more of the backstory and RP, the role-playing of it, that helps make the character a bit more complex. So that's where I'll end it here. That's the whole front page of it. The whole second page here is more your equipment and your armor and your spells. That will be its own video because there's a whole lot to get into there as well, and it's more the nitty-gritty of it. So thanks for watching, and hopefully this was a useful video. You'll see another one shortly in the following video on whatever I'm going to do next. So bye!